We've spent most of our time focusing on the ownership of the media at this point. We've been looking at how bigger and bigger companies are owning more and more of our media outlets across the country. Now, we want to shift over and look at how the government does limit these companies. So, we're going to look at the FCC and how the FCC regulates broadcast media outlets. So, here we've got some of the Federal Communications Commission. These would be the heads of the commission, the bureaucratic agency that oversees the regulation, and they make a lot of the decisions. So to remember bureaucracy stuff here, they get to make the details of the law dealing with broadcast media organizations. So let's start with the idea of regulating the media in general. The First Amendment guarantees that we have a free press. So that does protect journalists. It protects their freedom to report on the government and things like that. It protects outlets and organizations, newspapers, TV stations, radio channels, those kinds of things. It protects their right to report. But regulations are allowed on public broadcasters because the way that they reach us in our homes and in our cars and things like that is using infrastructure that the government put in place. The government is what builds the infrastructure to be able to broadcast TV signals and radio signals, and moving closer and closer to Wi-Fi signals across the country. So the government does have a role in regulating these things in order to make sure that they function effectively. So we're going to focus on the FCC today, but between the federal courts, the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission, all of these organizations play a role in regulating the mass media. The Federal Communication Commission was a bureaucratic agency set up in the 1930s to deal with the emergence of radio. It changes over time to deal with our communication infrastructure. So it has changed to incorporate television, to incorporate internet service providers, and now even handles things like wireless and cellular signals. It has powers to fine, and it even has the powers to take away the licenses of TV stations, of radio stations, of groups that don't comply with their policies and their regulations. The first thing the FCC regulates is licenses. They literally decide who can have a station on the radio or on the TV airwaves. The airwaves themselves, like the frequencies, those are a limited resource and they're owned by the people. So the government has to control how they're given out. So the government distributes licenses to the people that want to use them, and they license a certain station. So think about the radio in your car is an easy way to do this. They would give you a frequency like 107.1, and they would give another station a frequency like 107.5. They space out the signals so that the signals don't interfere with each other when we're trying to listen to these stations. Or even the same thing happens on television stations. They spread the channels out 3, 5, 13. The licenses get reviewed every 5 years, and the FCC has to make sure that these stations are serving the public interest. So this is why you'll often hear public service advertising, programs that serve the public good. They have to prove to the FCC that they're doing something good for the public to keep their license. And this also creates a system where the public can complain about what they see or hear broadcasted. So this creates a system where people can register complaints and say this station is showing something awful that shouldn't be in our homes, or this radio station is broadcasting bad language and things like that. So it lets people have a way to complain about what's being broadcast. The FCC also regulates what we've been dealing with most of today so far, which is ownership. They need to make sure that there's diverse voices that own the media outlets in each market. So they set limits about the number of newspapers and broadcast stations that one person or company can own within certain markets. So the FCC, they limit the amount of the amount of outlets that you could own nationwide in terms of TV stations and radio stations. And they also do that on a local level. So you want to make sure that, like, if you live in Memphis, that one company doesn't own all of the TV stations and radio stations and own the newspaper. We need diversity of voices here. So currently, the rules would allow a single company to own almost half, but at least limit it there. So we make sure that there are some diversity in ownership within different markets. What the FCC is most famous for regulating is they regulate the content of what we hear and see in broadcast outlets. So this is about like restricting indecency and obscenity. This is about making sure that the things that come over broadcast airwaves are relatively safe for people to watch and listen to. So again, this is only covering the TV stations that you could pick up with an antenna, and only covering the radio stations that you could pick up with an antenna in your car. So this is not about like cable or satellite or anything like that, not about the internet, but it does regulate content on broadcast TV and radio stations. So they can fine stations for things that they do that break the rules here. The fines have become a lot larger because this is a long time ago now, but the Janet Jackson, Justin Timberlake halftime show, there was some partial nudity shown on live TV in the middle of the Super Bowl, and people were so upset. So now the fines can be up to like a $500,000 for a single incident. So this is like, for live events especially, they've got to make sure that they're limiting like cursing and all kinds of stuff like that, or they can face huge fines. So the FCC sets guidelines for all of the programming that we see on TV and also on the radio. But this was in like mostly TV stuff was a response to like growing concerns from the public about the content of what they were seeing on TV, especially sexual content, violent content, and profanity. So starting in the 1990s, a chip has been put into all televisions, and these chips can be used to filter the programming that's seen on the TV. So then the stations put this rating system on all of their programming to let you know like who the programming is safe for. So this is like voluntary, but most all channels really use this. The rating tends to be displayed there for a few seconds. If you're watching live TV, the rating is there kind of after every commercial break to let you know what the content warning is. And so the FCC put in a system with TV manufacturers that would allow like parents to block certain levels of content from getting into their homes and to their children. So the rules here would limit like language, so especially what they call grossly offensive language. So it doesn't like limit every curse word that would be broadcast, but it limits the ones that are exceptionally offensive, and it considers context. So like you wouldn't say, like they wouldn't allow the S word to just be broadcast as part of a TV show or whatever. But for example, like if President Trump says it, then that is part of the news story. So like they make decisions about that. They limit any like sexual organs or excretory organs. Like you can't show different parts of the body. So this is a nudity limit here. And then there's also limits on violence and drug use. When you're watching shows that are broadcast across these networks, you'll notice that the violence is very carefully edited so that the violent acts aren't necessarily seen, and the drug use is never actually shown on TV. There are stricter guidelines for different times of the day. So generally, the time of the day between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. is considered to be a time when there's a chance that children are watching. So the guidelines are a little stricter, and the shows that come on later at night than those times have a little looser guidelines. The FCC also regulates the political content of these networks. So they need to make sure that the networks that are broadcast are not presenting just one-sided information. They want to make sure that they are fair to different sides of political issues. So there used to be a rule called the Fairness Doctrine. And this meant that stations that were using broadcast networks, they had to present controversial issues in a way that was balanced. So they had to make sure that if they were going to discuss, a particular side of a controversial issue, that they had to also air contrasting viewpoints. So this didn't necessarily require equal time for both, but it did require that the stations allow viewers to consider both sides of any sort of controversial political issue. By the late 1980s, we've already talked about how cable TV was spreading into people's homes. Cable TV is something that you pay for, so it doesn't have the same rules here and it doesn't have the same government regulation. So there were a lot of cable networks out there and cable news networks that didn't have to follow these same rules. And so President Reagan ended the fairness doctrine in the late 1980s. So now they don't necessarily have to prevent both sides of a political issue. And on local news programs or any broadcast news, it's possible that we see just one side of a particular issue presented. You'll often see journalists or anchors on the show start to tell you their opinion of the news. And that would be a thing that used to be, if they were going to share an opinion piece, we'd have to see a competing side. And now we no longer do. This is one of, getting rid of this rule is one of the big things that is causing increasing polarization between the parties. So viewers may watch a channel that only gives them conservative viewpoints and they become more conservative. And viewers may watch a channel that only gives them liberal viewpoints and become more liberal. Equal treatment rules are still enforced to a degree for election type activities. So this is still a policy. The equal time provision is enforced on broadcasters. So TV and radio stations have to give equal opportunities to any political candidates that request it. So if a station were to sell commercials to one candidate in an election, they must offer an equal amount of airtime at an equal price to any competing candidates. And that's what mostly this is about. But a channel couldn't let one candidate come on the news every night and talk directly to voters without allowing other candidates to do the same thing. So this is mostly about campaign ads and things like that. And there's definitely exceptions to this rule. It's really hard to enforce to make sure that the time is exactly equal or whatever, because for example, if there's a news story that involves a candidate, that doesn't mean that they have to go out and create a news story for all of the other candidates. If they interview a candidate as part of a news story, they don't have to interview every single candidate there is. But mostly what we're talking about here is ads. So, for example, in 2008, President Obama, when he was running for office, he purchased a 30-minute commercial to be aired on a few networks at night. So that's a ton of money and a ton of airspace. So John McCain did not just get to put out a 30-minute commercial of his own, but he was offered the opportunity to purchase 30 minutes of airtime to use however he wanted to. And ultimately, he decided not to because it was such a crazy amount of money. But they have to make sure that it is offered to all of the candidates in a particular race. All right, time to talk about our bigly ideas. So let's wrap up the things that we were talking about today with media ownership and FCC regulation. Here's our friend President Trump. He's rudely hogging the umbrella from First Lady Melania Trump here. So hopefully he'll start to share that umbrella soon. So today we want to make sure that we're able to talk about the impact of the corporate ownership of the media. There's good parts where they can criticize the government, and there's also negative parts where they mostly focus on profit. We want to make sure that we can describe the concentration of media ownership. This is changing. There are more and more big companies that own more and more of the media outlets. So we're having fewer and fewer diverse voices in our media. And we want to make sure that we can talk about the ways that the FCC regulates the broadcast media. So we're talking about how the FCC gives licenses, how the FCC regulates the ownership, and how the FCC monitors content to make sure that there's not bad stuff being broadcast, and also make sure that the candidates are being treated fairly. All right, that's it for our exploration of regulation of the media. We've just got a little more media stuff left to go through. We're going to look at some of the tools of the modern media, some of the things that we see a lot in the modern media, and we're going to talk about how whether or not people trust the media today.